To our next in the series of webinars focused on the future of real estate, and in this particular episode we're going to be focused on the future impact ESG is going to have on the real estate world. Obviously a very hot topic at the moment. Just before we sort of really get stuck into things, we'll do a brief round of introductions. So just quickly, my name's Alex Whiffin. I'm the founder and managing director at Cherry Pick People. We specialise in sort of talent consultancy for the real estate and prop tech world, sort of advising small and large businesses on how to manage their talent processes, put in place strategies, and ultimately source, recruit and retain the best talent. I'm passionate about the innovation of real estate and where this goes and how prop tech influences it and everything else. So ESG is obviously, as I say, a very hot topic, and I'm excited to get into this today. Sophie, do you want to just give us a quick rundown on your background and
Sure. What you're about? Dr. Sophie Taysom, founder and director of Kia Consulting. I work with companies across the built environment to develop their approach to ESG. I also established the LinkedIn group, ESG in Real Estate. Do feel free to join if you haven't already. So that has recently hit 2.6 thousand members, so that's quite exciting. I'm a trustee with Groundwork London, which is a brilliant charity that works on people, place and planet. A non-exec director with TrustTech that works on providing a holistic approach to prop tech solutions, and a specialist member of the healthcare executive at the Institution of Engineering and Technology.
Fantastic. Luke, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Hi, everybody. My name is Luke Graham. I'm the head of research at Pi Labs, which is an early stage VC fund disrupting the way that we interact with the built world. So investing in the technologies, early stage technologies that are disrupting the way we interact with the built world. My job is a little bit unconventional for a VC. It does exist, but not as prevalent as some others, like investment and those sorts of things. So essentially my role at Pi Labs is to, the way that some people frame it, be the eyes and ears, say, of our team, identifying, emerging macro trends and those sorts of things. And obviously a big part of that for quite some time has been this conversation around ESG and the sustainability of real estate. So it's become a very big part of my job over recent years.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, Andrew, would you give us a rundown on your background?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, I'm currently with RICS, and for those of you who don't know RICS, we're an international standard setting and professional members organisation for the built and natural environment with over 110,000 members working worldwide. They work right across the property life cycle, across all the asset types. And my role is to look at the effect of data and technology right across that broad canvas, which obviously is an incredibly interesting piece at the moment. And I also run a partner program where we work with around 300 kind of data and tech firms around the world who are impacting the built environment. And obviously many of them are looking at how they can support that ESG journey as well.
Fantastic. Well, thanks everybody for your intros. And obviously everyone out there watching, it'd be great to, I know we had over 200 people registered, so it's great to see that, and thanks for registering. It'd be great to find out where people are and just sort of say hi. So please put a note in the chat box, or the panelists can see your questions as well. So really keen to get our audience participation. So if you have any good questions, please post them in the chat, and we'll endeavour to answer them if we can. And we'll jump into it now and start the discussion. So I suppose the first question I would like to ask the panelists is, where do you think ESG will have the greatest impact within the real estate world? Andrew, do you want to kick us off with your thoughts there?
Yeah, surely. I guess a thought I always have when we talk about ESG is it's still quite a confusing set of acronyms, and I think there are a lot of multiple understandings of what we mean when we talk about ESG. So I might kind of disassemble it and just talk about the environmental, the social, the governance piece, and talk about those three fairly quickly, if I may. I think for better or for worse, I think that the greatest impact in the short term will be on that that environmental piece, particularly around emissions. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, because clearly there's a huge imperative to make sure that the vast amount of emissions that are produced both in the construction cycle as embodied carbon, but also on the operational side, it's incredibly important that we do reduce that, and also think about the kind of waste aspects of landfill and water usage, all those kind of broader things around the environmental impact. And I think for better or for worse, that's going to be driven by two things, one of which hopefully is a degree of altruism by the sector to realise that it should tidy up its act, as it were, and make sure that the impact that real estate makes on the planet is reduced, because I know it's an often quoted figure, but it is circa 40% of emissions come out of the built environment in some way, if you include infrastructure. So that's obviously a huge impact. And we should also remember it's not just commercial real estate, because it's quite easy to kind of focus these conversations very much on the commercial sector when we forget the impact of residential, when you think of just the UK market, where there's upwards of 19 million homes that really need to be upgraded to a higher level of EPC just on that kind of energy consumption. So I think a degree of altruism, but also a degree of stick, to use the carrot and stick metaphor. There's a lot of legislation coming down the line that will force asset owners, whether they want to be altruistic or not, to improve the quality of their buildings in terms of energy performance. And obviously with just the cost of energy, there's also an imperative from a cost perspective. So I think for better or for worse, there'll be a lot of focus on that E, which is important. I think the bigger opportunity, or an additional opportunity, is also to be thinking about how we can really make real estate in all its forms great places for people to be in, because I think historically the focus has been on bricks and mortar and clearly income value from an investor asset owner perspective, but there's a huge opportunity to think about, particularly post-pandemic, in terms of working practices, in terms of air quality and livability, and also with the extremes of what we're already beginning to live with in terms of the effects of climate change, is focusing on the people aspect of property. So I think there's huge opportunities here to make sure that real estate is not only a home for people, an investment class, but really actually I think begins to deliver for people in a way that perhaps it historically hasn't. It's been seen too much as bricks and mortar rather than places where we work, live, play, get healed, get educated. And I think that's the biggest opportunity, is making real estate a bit more people focused.
Yeah, I certainly agree with everything you've said, Andrew. For me, okay, first I'm going to say I'm looking at this through very much a positive frame. Because in the background there are lots of discussions about ESG as woke and all these sort of attacks, and we won't go into that because it's tedious. So for me, there are really two areas. So there's something significant around decarbonisation of the built environment, and if that is done well, it has real sort of multiplier effects for health and well-being, public health, positive job creation, all of these sorts of things. I think building on that second point, really around social value, is I'm hoping we will very much move to there's a better understanding of what good looks like. So we're not just looking at immediate impacts, but also those longer term, because there's something about saying you've created 100 jobs, but to be honest, if those jobs are all rubbish jobs and disappear as soon as the building's been built, you're potentially doing more harm than good. And a term I came across in Brussels last week, which I thought was brilliant, is not greenwashing, but citizen washing. So it's basically you do this kind of community engagement. I think we've all seen examples of this. You either only listen to the kind of bigger businesses, the sort of corporate alliances, what have you, or you only listen to those who shout loudest. So I think actually grounding social value and making it meaningful is hopefully somewhere we'll get to in the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, it's interesting what a couple of you have said. I've taken a couple of notes here. Andrew, your point on the great places to be in. I hear that, but not very often. So the point around like E obviously being the most heavily weighted in this acronym, certainly, something that I think there's a lot of agreement on. the social sustainability side, or even kind of more broadly there, that point around livability has been increasingly interesting to us as well. We've put obviously a lot of time and effort into the environmental piece and made quite a number of investments in our portfolio have been specifically environmental, and I'll probably use a few of those as examples during this conversation. But yeah, there's certainly this really interesting point as well around social sustainability, around say like the example I always use in cities, right? So a big conversation is this mass urbanization, this 1 billion plus people who are going into cities over the next 27 years, right? So what sort of impact will that have? What requirement for construction is there? All this sort of stuff, and how are those spaces going to be livable? So for a bit of context, if you consult something as ancient as the Old Testament or the Torah, you will see, say, negative perceptions of cities and their impact on interpersonal relationships and things like this. You know, you have the example of Babel or Babylon. You have the example of Sodom and all these places. Cities have always been framed in a negative way from a social sustainability point, from a virtue standpoint, safety, sin, all these sorts of things, right? So is there a way that this ESG movement shifts that perception of the city, and is that technology enabled? If so, how? All those sorts of things. So I think that's where we'll see a lot of shift in the next 5 to 10 years. Certainly a lot on energy, as Sophie and Andrew have pointed out, but also now a bit more focus on the social side.
Yeah, and I suppose if we think about kind of CBDs, and I suppose that there's also an interesting kind of contrast between perhaps the developing world as opposed to the developed world, where the challenge is almost how do we regenerate CBDs in the developed world in terms of getting people, quote, back to work and making sure those cities don't, lose the vibrancy of having people there during the day. And then obviously in the developing world, you've still got this urbanization taking place. And I guess, as you say, is there a balancing point where we just simply end up with, and in a funny way, I think this kind of concept of the smart city for me is as much around the kind of design and simplicity as it is the technology, because, and I know there's a lot of negative comments about this concept of the 15-minute city, which is a bizarre kind of interpretation of that as ever, that we live in a world where people can twist things in a really odd way. Because I live in a suburb of London, which for me is the perfect kind of 15-minute suburb, in the sense that I've got everything I want on my doorstep in terms of GP and vets and dentist, and I literally can walk everywhere, and if I want to get into central London I can get on a train, and I obviously don't feel constrained by that. But this sense of places that are almost to some extent turning the clock back, where you can actually do a lot of your living without having to have that kind of hyper connectivity of having to travel lots to do stuff. And I think it's almost hard when we think about real estate now, both I think residential and commercial, to disentangle the shift that we have seen in the developed world post-pandemic, that people want outside space. They want more physical space in their home if they're going to have a blended workspace, and they do want more choices about where they physically live. They don't want to commute as much, for better or for worse. And we've also got that sense from obviously the commercial world, where there's a kind of flight to quality in office space. Now, I hear what you're saying, Luke, about not hearing about a lot of kind of discussions about making places better, but I think there's an element of not perhaps altruistic, but a recognition that high quality, different kind of floor plates, much more focus on sustainability for offices is going to, certainly at the top end of the office market, make and force people to think about how they do fit their buildings out and how they really do walk the walk in terms of making those buildings not only energy efficient, but certainly in the way they're retrofitted, in the way that sustainability is addressed. So I think some of these will be pressures of doing the right thing, but also just making those buildings attractive to tenants and occupiers.
Yep. And picking up on that point, I think there's something very interesting around that S element about how we do use our spaces, our hybrid working, all of these sorts of things, and how that's impacting the workforce of the future, but also how companies are positioning themselves in relation to ESG. So it's no longer about this is the way business is done. There have been seismic shifts across the market over the last few years, And companies are having to respond very quickly to that, particularly if they want to attract and retain workforce.
How much
was discussed in our
Sorry, go ahead, Alex.
yeah, we had our previous webinar was the future of the office, and we touched on a number of these points, which sort of brought this conversation about as well. But that was a lot of the discussion in that webinar about the the need post COVID for obviously it's the need for the office space to attract people back into the office, and part of that is making sure that those environments are really attractive. Just to not from necessarily from an ESG motivation. They're looking to get people back in there, but to do that, they need to create much more appealing workspaces that are doing more for the people going in there. So yeah, that's a very interesting topic, but driven by maybe commercials over the ESG, but it has a positive impact on that because of it. I've had a question from Daniel Clements here. This is an EMAP site. I'll put it on here. Are a leading OS supplier for data in the UK. What data is key to future-proof assets? How can we help the industry?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I could talk for hours on. I think one of the biggest problems is that the sector is so poor at curating data in the first place. So it's almost not what kind of data do we need. We just need data because, I think one can say in many respects it's shocking the lack of data we have on real estate assets, both in the residential world, but also commercial real estate. I mean, we're getting better, but we have an industry that historically does things on bits of paper, and if they're turned into a PDF, they think they've digitized. So we lack. Well, that's the reality. I mean, and there's a lot of activity going on. People are beginning to build structured data sets. They're using technology to, as we all know, bring out rent rolls from effectively PDFs and other kind of documents. But there is a long way to go in terms of just getting well curated data that you can trust on buildings, and we can think of many instances where there have been use cases where we simply don't have the right data. And if you think of doing due diligence, whether that's buying or selling a house or renting or buying or selling a commercial property, there's a huge amount of time that's taken to effectively produce a data room to enable participants to really understand what they're transacting on. And so that's one of our big challenges as a sector, is that we haven't treated real estate assets in the way we treat aeroplanes or cars, where you'd have that kind of history of service, bill of materials. We've all probably had recalls on cars where they know that a certain component needs replacing, and you get a letter and say, right, bring your car in and we'll change it. And so we've got this, unfortunately, this culture of building stuff and really not knowing actually what's inside it, and then not really maintaining a good data set. So I think one of the good outputs on the focus, particularly on the kind of energy side and performance, will be forcing asset owners to start curating data properly, and that will have a cost, and it's a cultural change. But we just need lots of data, even some of the basics. How big is it? How many floors? What's the floor plate? To understand, what are the energy bills? What's the waste going out of this building? What's the water consumption? What's the air quality? Stuff we just don't have. Do we have enough information on footfall to understand when to turn the HVAC off to save money? Just some really basic stuff.
So in conversations with clients, my view is always just get started.
Yeah.
I think there's that much bigger data point, particularly around net zero ambitions or these sorts of things. I have come across companies, a couple in conversation, I won't name names, but it's things like, right, so you've got lots of assets, you've made a big commitment to net zero, what's your baseline? Where's your roadmap? Where are you alongside your roadmap? And I must say, I'm not someone who can do roadmaps to net zero, hands up there. And it's like nothing. So it's like you've made this huge commitment without really understanding what it means for you, for your company, for your assets. So I think it's almost like, start with baby steps, really. Start somewhere.
On the CRE point, because I've obviously dabbled in both residential and commercial across a few jurisdictions, and something that you were just saying, Andrew, reminds me of a project we actually did at Oxford's Future of Real Estate. A colleague of mine led it, or former colleague of mine, I should say, by the name of Fabian Braisman. and I'm not sure if he's actually in the audience. If he is, in that off chance that you're here, Fabian, say hello. But that was his probably among his more challenging papers that he wrote, and one of the biggest challenges around it, or that he led, I should say. One of the biggest challenges around it was not just the how sparse the data was and how spotty it was and all those sorts of things, but it was also say the proprietary level, especially of commercial data, right? And so the challenge then is, okay, if we're in this sort of adversarial relationship on the commercial side, and maybe to a lesser extent Resi, because a lot of that is public information, how much is that then influencing the way that we're able to make informed decisions on how say sustainable interventions impact things like energy consumption, or say utilize space in an office building or in retail, and all those sorts of things. So all of this is still a mystery, because a lot of the key players are still sort of not sharing their notes, so there's the digitalization challenge, and the fact that once it is digitalized, it's held in-house and held very, very passionately, say.
Yeah, I think, Luke, I think what you mentioned goes to the heart of one of the almost the key behavioral problems, particularly, as you say, in that commercial sector, that data is hoarded rather than shared. I mean, in a previous life, I've worked in data pooling organizations where we've had data in the FMCG world where competitors have explicitly shared their customer files, because they know that getting the full view of the market is much more powerful in terms of customer profiling than it is having their X% share just hoarded by themselves. So I think there is a big behavioral change that the sector needs to actually engage in, to realize that it's a slightly Pyrrhic victory to have this sort of little bit of data hoarded, when if you're going to benchmark, if you're going to understand what good looks like, either within your portfolio or the broader market, those barriers need to be broken down. And also there are inherent barriers, as you know, within commercial real estate between the asset owner and the occupier in terms of utility bills and all those things. And I think we just have to realize that the sector, and I go back to this 40%, it's kind of irresponsible for the sector to say, no, we're not going to share data because we just don't like doing that, when actually, well, I'm sorry, from Planet perspective, that's not good enough anymore.
But I think we are starting to see a bit of a shift in that. Certainly some conversations earlier in the year when the energy crisis really kind of gathered pace, where suddenly tenants were wanting to have those conversations with facilities managers for the first time ever. So I think it was this sort of shock and realization that this stuff, it actually costs money. So it's getting down to that sort of, it costs a lot. I think also what we're starting to see is very much a shift towards green leases and changing expectations amongst tenants and occupiers. So it is still taking some time, but I think there's a greater willingness to think about elements of green leases, and also within that, obviously, it's about how can you get those data conversations happening in a way that's meaningful.
Great points. I just want to jump in here as we've got a couple of other questions. Mike Joyner says, Andrew, let me share this one so you can see it all as well. But he said, Andrew spoke about the 19 million homes in the UK that need to be retrofitted. And by the way, we've got people from all over the world on the audience, but I'm sure this is applicable globally as well. How are we going to engage with the owners of these homes and connect with them with the right people, with the right knowledge, to make the required retrofit as easy and cost effective as possible? Because even in 90% of the housing stock is not going to be fit for purpose in 20 years time or something like that. I can't remember the exact stats, but I'd like to understand what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge problem, because I think there's a danger sometimes that we focus on commercial real estate, but this is a bigger problem. It's a huge asset time. I mean, I know we're talking globally here, but just in scale, I forget the number from Savills, but I think the UK residential stock is something like 6 or 7 trillion pounds, whereas the commercial real estate stock is like 1 million. So it's a huge asset type. And I think it's ironic that we don't look at it in those terms. We just think, oh, well, there's lots of thousands of houses out there, millions of houses, and they're all individually worth X. If we had an asset that the UK PLC had that was worth 6 or 7 trillion pounds, we'd be thinking about it in a very different way. And I think the challenge is we've got this hugely dispersed housing stock of different quality held in various forms of rental, mortgage, totally owned. And the biggest challenge is almost, well, there's a number of challenges, because I'm not sure I know what the solution is, because if you look at the average amount of money that probably would need to be spent on an average property, it represents for a lot of householders their entire equity in that property, sort of 30, 40k, depending on how much it's going to cost. And you've also got the fact that we simply don't have the supply chain and the trained people in place to actually do this in a relatively quick time. There are not 19, 20 million, supply chain people out there and heat pumps and all that stuff to do it. So I think this is a challenge that is kind of kicked around, but we haven't embraced it and really thought, what does the supply chain look like? What does the grant situation look like for households that can't afford it, opposed to the self-pay? And how do we actually, through a combination of nudge, but also particularly in the rental sector in terms of sort of minimum energy levels, how do we actually encourage people to engage with this process? Because most people really aren't focused on it, don't realise the implications of perhaps some of the legislation that's coming down the line, and simply don't have the money themselves to do this. And there's also a potentially huge issue that if we don't have the right kind of skills out there, there'll be a lot of very faulty workmanship done, the wrong kind of interventions, doing something to the fabric which doesn't work or builds in defects for the future, or recommending a heat pump when frankly the building won't benefit from it. So I think, unfortunately, I don't have an answer here, because it's such a huge problem that I don't think the body politic has really actually grasped the seriousness of this and thought about the implications for training, for supply chain, for grants, for the kind of grassroots local authority impact that they can have, and how you kind of from a bottom-up perspective also target perhaps areas where there's fuel poverty, where you can perhaps use satellite imaging to really work out where the biggest issues are and start on a prioritized basis and really address this.
So
sorry, go ahead.
So, okay, just adding on that, certainly on the financing point, I know a lot of work is looking at alternative sort of models. So there's a model in the US, which I can't speak to as an expert by any means, called CPACE. So it's basically you take out investment that the loan effectively sits with the value of the property. That may be a model. I think sort of banks, lending institutions need to be, I know they're doing a lot of work around this, but it's difficult because for them, the amounts of money are quite small for the amount of effort required. Certainly 100% agree with Andrew around actually where is the skilled workforce of the future. There are a number of projects. So I've been involved in a project working across Southeast London, some of the FE colleges. How do you encourage and support the workforce of the future? I think what I would like to say is, in terms of grants, what is absolutely critical, and I think really it was a dismal failure with the Green Homes Grant, is the absolute need to engage with the people who are already working in this sector. And are the builders, engaging with developing materials, all of these sorts of things. So understanding kind of what their needs are, funding flows. So, I spoke to a number of builders when the Green Homes Grant was moving forward, and it's like, well, we've got too much to go through to even get on the books. We don't know when we might ever get paid for this stuff. It just didn't work for them. So it's like, how do we have those wider conversations, including with the workforce?
What I was going to say is around, say, the decentralized nature of residential as well. So not only is obviously residential much larger than commercial in at least every market I'm aware of. What are the possible exceptions? I can't think of any. But the nature of that, so this has always been a bit of a quagmire in my mind. It's something I've struggled with reconciling. But on the one hand, say you can break the housing market into people who own and live in, so owner-occupiers, that's generally referred to as the social housing sector, which is a big part of the UK, obviously, and lesser so in other markets, conventionally in Europe, quite significant. And then the private rented sector. And I'm comfortable with picking on the private rented sector a bit here, that generally they're the worst performing in almost every way, right? Regardless of whichever way you frame it, the private rented sector is pretty bad in the UK. I would go as far as to say like among the worst of any market I've analysed. And one of the elements that influence that, I think, is, okay, we have this dynamic where who are the landlords in the private rented sector? Historically, you know, it might be, say, an upper middle class or a wealthy individual who owns a portfolio of residential assets, possibly dispersed. As Andrew made the point of earlier, the challenge of UK housing is obviously among the oldest, I think the oldest in the world, and really diverse type of stock. And you have almost the accountability challenge here and everywhere in the private rented sector. So commercial real estate, some of the bigger names here, say Grosvenor, GPE, those types, they have a reputation to maintain when it comes to their sustainable behaviours and their metrics, right? Joe Bloggs, my landlord, who wants to come back into this house after they finish their time up in Manchester, has no real reputational incentive to render this house more sustainable. And then you have the challenge of, well, does housing then become an investable asset for corporates? And obviously there's an argument against that from the social sustainability angle. Is housing an investable asset, or is housing, you know, obviously we're pretty far down that road anyway, but there's a few kind of systemic sort of or wicked problem type framings of this where, you know, for every solution, somebody might be raising some type of problem. So it's I don't know. I mean, Sophie, you make good points around green finance and things like that. Is financial incentive the way to go to if reputation is not a part of this equation the same way it might be with commercial real estate and larger assets?
Yeah, and I think there is also that sort of education piece, particularly around that, looking at capital investment versus long-term sort of operational. So it's this sort of, I know there have been surveys and people will say, of course, I'll pay 10, 20% more for a property if it's green. But what does that actually mean when it's down to signing the mortgage papers? So it's that big distinction between intention and action. So it's effectively, how do we close that gap? And obviously finance is a core component to that.
And not only is there a value action gap, but I guess my question to Andrew and his comrades at RICS is there a valuation gap as well? You know, if someone's willing to pay a 10 to 30% premium for energy efficiency, I assume part of that might be reflected if it impacts net operating income. But I imagine there's still a bit of a gap there for someone to get it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perennial question, and obviously valuers take ESG criteria into account. But the critical thing, and if I had a dollar or a pound for every time I've explained this, I'd be lying on a beach somewhere rather than speaking here. But what valuers have to do is reflect the market. They hold a mirror up to the market, and they hold a mirror up to what participants are willing to pay for a particular property, whether that's rental, capital, value in both commercial and resi. And as we all know, if we buy a house, there are a number of factors we look at. Some of those are going to be amenity based in terms of schools and gardens and south facing, and some of it will be energy efficiency, but it's not part of the whole story. Similarly with an office, you'll be looking, if it's already occupied, you're looking at covenant strength and lease terms and other locational factors. So certainly ESG and various criteria will play a role in the valuation, but I think it's slightly overcooking it to say that if a building is of an energy rating X, that automatically gives you an uplift or a down, or a discount or a haircut of Y, because there are lots of factors. And I think from that point of view, increasingly ESG factors will have a positive effect. But the other way of looking at it is it may well be that you simply end up with that being the market value and everything else having a discount. So it may not be a premium anymore. It may just turn into, look, unless it fulfills these certain criteria, we're going to look for a discount sort of thing. So it's never quite as simple as that. And I think it comes back to the question we were asked earlier about data. What's incredibly important is both buyer and seller being fully informed about the ESG data on a building, because you can't make a value judgment unless you know the data.
Yeah, and I guess to reinforce that point, it's where you talk about discount. That's stranded. That's where we start talking about stranded asset, right? So, if this asset's stranded, obviously valuation plummets unless there's another highest and best use, which presumably there isn't if it's stranded. and so on. Sorry, Alex, I'll hand back to you.
And in fact, Luke, I had a very interesting conversation over lunch with a valuer a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying that in a funny way, the conversation's now spinning round, and this was about commercial real estate, and it was, okay, well, let's stop thinking about the sort of damage to value and simply say, okay, this asset should get a market value of X. What do I need to spend to get it there? So the conversation is turning around in a positive way to say, actually, it's not about whether the value goes up or down. It's, look, this is the kind of effective rent you should get from this asset in this location. What do I need to spend to get it there?
And you mentioned the data again, Andrew, and I just wanted to bring in a question from Carol Shields. She said, we've developed a sustainability model to help property managers share energy, waste and water data to their occupiers to better contextualize how their occupation impacts on ESG. However, we struggle to get a standardized data format. What's the, how can we change this? So they struggle. She said however, they struggle to get a standardized data format from energy consultants, let alone move onto a more automated approach to collecting data. How can we change this?
Well, I mean, I suppose from my point of view, I mean, there are standards out there, but I suppose one of the ways we could do this is simply ban people using Excel, because everybody builds their own models and sets up their own spreadsheets. So I'm not going to get my Christmas card from Microsoft, but joking aside, everybody has their own little silo of data, and we do end up in a sector where we call the same thing different names, so we end up with this lack of standardization around the whole data piece. On a positive note, there's a lot of people out there with clever AI tools who overcome this by saying, well, actually, we accept that the raw data is going to be a bit of a mess. It's going to be PDFs. It's going to be in different formats. Let's use some clever AI to train it to actually say, let's get ourselves into a standard format to actually overcome that problem. Because I think realistically, we're not going to get the industry to standardize its data curation quickly. So maybe the answer is to look at these clever tools that say, yeah, give me the data you've got, and we'll turn it into a good destination data lake, sort of good kind of version of the data, because we perhaps need that intervening step, that use of AI to tidy the data up and curate it, because I think getting the sector to overnight standardize on some data standard is probably over optimistic, I think.
Sophie, were you going to say something there?
No.
I would just drop one name, which is OmniView, which is spelled differently to how you might assume that you would. So it's the way that you hear it, OMNEVUE. They've been, and I mean, full disclosure, they're an investment that PyLabs has made, but they might have some interesting sort of approaches to that kind of address this point.
Yeah, and I say, I mean, from the partners I work with, there are people who are all around the world addressing this issue of really poor quality data, mix of documents, mix of standard, mix of structured data, but called different things. And they're using AI to try and curate that and pull that together, whether that's looking at rent rolls for investment purposes or looking at for ESG data. Because, I know one asset owner who said, yeah, we got great data on our waste. And it turned out they had great PDFs from their waste vendor. So that was their great data.
Perhaps, getting back to, the topic about the future impact of ESG on real estate, I'd like to think sort of a bit positively for a moment and talk about what opportunities might be there for, for owners, occupiers, agents, wider society. Maybe looking a little bit further into the future, you can, where this might be. I know it's hard to do, but, that's the purpose of these things. So.
Yeah, I think there are some fantastic opportunities. So again, trying to be optimistic and building on one of Andrew's earlier points, there's a real opportunity to think deeply about the spaces we inhabit and also how we adapt and manage in relation to climate change. So that's obviously a significant risk. It's also, we need to think about creatively about that sort of adaptive and resilience piece. In more concrete terms, it's about leveraging the building, really the benefits of this shift towards things like green buildings, which will increasingly be the norm for owners and occupiers. For occupiers, some of the opportunities are actually about enhanced workspaces, improved health and well-being, improved concentration, also reduction in things like energy costs. Obviously, you've got that balance between CapEx and OpEx. More widely, in terms of opportunities, I think there is very much an opportunity to embed proper community engagement as part of the ESG. Or at least that's what I'd like to see. So again, coming back to avoid the citizen kind of washing, which I think many of us will have seen in the past. But how do we have those conversations and really focus very much on that place-based piece, which is critical, because our built environment is not just this kind of generic mass. It's very much about how does it work at that local level for individuals, families, communities, businesses, that whole essential ecosystem.
Yeah, it's interesting that you make those points around placemaking. Again, that's something that's kind of getting a lot of my attention at the moment. Something I've been paying attention to, despite what some audience members might have as question marks over the technological intensity of this, has been the impact that biodiversity has on a lot of those points you made, Sophie. So things like concentration, things like air quality, things like cognitive well-being, things like that. So, I mean, obviously, I have a vested interest trying to put green anywhere I turn my head inside my house and out. But I really like what the French have been doing with biodiversity, green roofs and those sorts of things. And we're seeing it, I was standing on our rooftop, the Pi Labs office in the centre of Soho, London, only yesterday, conveniently, and looking around at all the cranes and the green rooftops, or the absence, say, of green rooftops in arguably one of the more green parts of London. And thinking to myself, there are, this isn't like a theory that people are working with. There are really well-established, how would I frame this, understandings in the academic and broadly intellectual community of the value of biodiversity, from absorbing issues around urban heat islands, around capturing of runoff water, and again, around the well-being of people in those spaces. To the point where, if you put something green and blue in front of somebody, symbolizing obviously green and water, they respond differently in their brain chemistry than they do if that same image is absent of those features. So it seems like there's a really long way to go for quite a few markets. Again, I won't name names, but certainly some newer developments in many different cities I've visited where that's really lacking. And any attempt that they have made has been a really superficial one. So an example that was shared with me only the other day was that somebody considered their green roof that they put a bunch of beehives on the top of their skyscrapers, right? And every season they had to go and change out the beehives again because they didn't have anything there to support this life, right? They didn't have any pollinating plants, all those sorts of things. So doing it in a mindful way, I think there's a massive opportunity there. And also then I think for the construction sector, government is heavily incentivizing now digitalization, as well as environmental sustainability in the construction process. So from an entrepreneurial perspective, I would say construction tech, there are massive opportunities there. We've all heard about the economic downturn and around dry up in different types of funding. If you look at European construction tech, it is last year was the second highest year in history of funding for European construction tech in venture funding. So it's bucking that trend. So yeah, a lot of opportunity there.
It's also worth just touching very briefly on kind of regs legislation in this space. So obviously in the UK, we have biodiversity net gain. I think what's really interesting in the EU, so there's currently a piece of legislation before Parliament on nature restoration, which is not specific to the built environment. It's much broader, but yeah, sort of the opportunities and there are some great examples. So the city council, the council in Brussels are looking at actually how do we significantly increase local food production, as in Brussels itself. And the work happening in terms of nature restoration, how do we align this with things like offshore wind farms? That was another conversation. So it's not an either or, it's a both and, which changes the nature of that conversation. And also, how do we engage, for instance, with nature restoration, with reducing carbon, potentially even carbon offsets? How do we engage with large landowners, with farmers, with a whole range of, with, people who fish, all of these sorts of things? But that's going off on a tangent. It's a great topic.
Hey, prop tech is everything, Sophie. That's our saying, right? Prop tech touches everything.
No, I mean, it's interesting that you both mentioned that biodiversity. I did a video discussion with one of our partners. They're actually based down in Australia, but they're actually beginning to use technology to provide the kind of biodiversity data that developers need to actually understand not only the impact of placemaking, but how you then monitor it on an ongoing basis. And it's down to the level of counting species, but also I think, as perhaps you touched on, both of you, Sophie and Luke, that making sure that you connect habitats in a city, that we don't lose that connectivity, because as we know, a lot of the problems with habitat loss are, breaking the bridges, breaking those connections between habitat. And I think for me, perhaps placing aside owners, occupiers, agents, this more wider societal outcome is making cities much more livable, much greener, literally, but also livable. If we think back to what it was like to be, in a kind of very urban, high density setting during the pandemic, when you couldn't.
Oh, it was. You're making a wonderful.
And there weren't, enough green spaces.
We lost you for a second, Andrew.
All right, am I back? Good. No, I was just reflecting on the real challenge that people, if they were in a fairly dense urban area. Luke talked about kind of heat islands. We've got to be really thinking that cities now should be livable, and I think that's really also a kind of the flip side of the issue of return to work and hybrid working. I think London, particularly as an example, it's a city that people have got used to not living in. Whereas, you go somewhere like Paris, as Luke mentioned, and it's a much more lived-in city, and I think that has real benefits in terms of both, equality and simply the vibrancy and viability of a city. So let's focus on what real estate can do for society.
And something in the context of things like public health, the business case is really, really clear. So in terms of, there's good evidence to demonstrate areas without a lot of tree coverage at ground level, it can be 5-10 degrees hotter. That's literally the difference between whether or not someone ends up in hospital, whether or not someone has a kind of heat-related stroke, all sorts of other things, let alone pollutants and everything else. So I think we need to better understand and act on this set of considerations around, biodiversity. It's not just a nice to have, it's fundamental to our community's kind of health and well-being. And that's both the COVID, but it's also about managing extreme weather events and building resilience and adaptive cities, which is going to be absolutely critical going forward.
On quantifying that, really good point, Sophie. There's an interesting case study that I reviewed a couple of years ago now in Vienna, a company called Green Pass, again from our portfolio, where the sort of way that they were able to quantify the positioning and the quantity and say the species of each tree or plant or whatever on IKEA. From memory, Hauptbahnhof. I could be wrong. Just maybe check IKEA Vienna would be a easier way to find that. But yeah, interesting case study there on that. And
I guess what was interesting, Luke, a slightly different factor in the Vienna story is the kind of mayor, the lead by the mayor there in terms of inexpensive public transport. You need to kind of link all these things together. If you do, yes, we need to do things it's sort of in isolation in a good way in terms of little initiatives, but you've got to have that kind of broader thinking about, that particularly now with city mayors leading this kind of thought process about how do we actually design in terms of, car-free roads, get bicycles back as they've done on Paris streets and Amsterdam, because people think Amsterdam always was cycling friendly. It wasn't. There had to be real decisions made to actually force cars off certain streets to return them to that. And I think, thinking about the way you price public transport can be a real lever as well.
And it's also how you construct spaces with a view to ensuring their inclusiveness. So, for instance, what's really interesting about city spaces is how that can be experienced fundamentally differently based on sex. So moving through those spaces is completely different. That will also cross-cut with the ethnicity and other considerations. So it's how do we build spaces which are inclusive and work for people. I've been really interested in following the work of Architecture Design Scotland, because they do some really interesting work, particularly around sort of inclusive spaces, but also intergenerational spaces. So it's not this kind of, well, we need to build a sort of residential facility, we'll put it in the middle of nowhere where there's a bus once a week into town. So, yeah.
Yeah, really good point. And, even heuristics wise, like on an anecdotal level, it was a nice little awakening for me when I first moved to London, when, my wife had me keep my phone in my pocket if she was, moving from the tube station to another space at a certain time of day in a certain place and all those sorts of things, going, oh, here I am, never having contemplated that. And if I was an architect, I would never have probably accounted for that in my design. So really good point.
Alison Proctor asked the question related to this. So how do we get all the city residents to engage with the plan for the future?
Well, I guess this is actually an area where technology can really be very powerful, because I think the way we can, and I know, the digital twin is a very overused term, but I think painting visual pictures for people of what a development can look like, as opposed to 2D drawings, and giving some really kind of immersive experiences to people, very early on in the design stage to engage with the community, I think is incredibly important. Because as Sophie said, we need to make these places safer for every kind of individual and community. We need to make sure that these places are truly mixed. I know it's an overused term in terms of mixed use, but they should be part of the community, not a separate piece. And as you say, Sophie, from an intergenerational point of view, why have senior living somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, or kind of almost as a separate island? We want to have every age group, every kind of form of person included in the development, and we need to paint what that visual picture looks like to show people, to say, actually, I do want this now, because I can see the improvement to the space we will get compared to the status quo. So I think technology can really be an enabler here in terms of showing and making people feel what that space is going to look like.
And I think technology also in the context of engaging with, at the community level, with wider stakeholder groups right across the piece. So that sort of, community engagement piece pre-planning, it's how do you make that meaningful? So tech can certainly be supportive in that way to engage, particularly with people who might not normally engage in the planning process. And also sort of not necessarily a kind of tech solution, but how do we do that through engagement piece in a meaningful, proper way? And some of it's as simple as, if you do have a very diverse community, how do you engage with different groups of people? So that could come down to language. How do you ensure that when you're making it immersive, albeit it might be physically, if you're using the local school hall, actually is that physically accessible? Does it feel safe to get to? If those sort of community engagement pieces are at night in the middle of winter, do you have to walk through a park to get there? It's all of these. For me, this stuff shouldn't be rocket science. but sometimes it's positioned as such.
That's an interesting point, and this is very a convenient sort of route that we've taken in this discussion, because only yesterday I was having a conversation with a property developer, actually out in Eastern Europe, and he was talking about to Andrew's point on digital twins, right, around like visualization, 3D visualization of incomplete spaces. Was talking about how, okay, the first angle of that for them was that they said, okay, we need to be able to take our occupiers through this space without them visiting it, because at the time it was COVID, right? Then as COVID sort of, waned away and we were returning to somewhat of this new normal that we were speaking about, say in 21, 22, what they realized is that, well, okay, well, the behavioral change had happened. And so they stuck with those virtual tours as part of their marketing strategy, right? And instead now they weren't putting together these PDFs and all this sort of stuff to try and market these spaces in the conventional way. But the interesting point was, he said to me, the next stage for us is to the point that Sophie and Andrew have made around community consultation, around the fact that, most of the community doesn't know what either a commercial or a resi project is going to look like until it's done. Even me as a real estate person, there's a Lend Lease project happening just down the road, and I still haven't looked at its renders. I have no idea what it's going to look like. I hope it's good. But I think the community consultation point there is a really good one. And I think as far as adoption of the tech that enables that, we saw a lot of fanfare around the Apple Vision Pro. That's obviously very high end of market. That's $3,500 USD. That's, for say commercial use for the time being. But if those sorts of tech, or if that sort of tech, I should say, which seems a bit esoteric, seems a bit up in the air and, a bit pie in the sky, metaverse conversation, the reputation of that word sort of waned over the last 12 months, those sorts of things. But some of those use cases there, those real legitimate use cases in 3D space, and also community consultation. There's a company, Built ID, that's been around for a few years that was meant to decentralize that community consultation point, to what you were saying, Sophie. So absolutely confirm, the point around technology's role in this. Obviously, our position at Pi Labs is that technology is central to this. No longer is it, putting up signs in the street saying that this is going to happen and here's like a sketch sort of impression of it, or the floor plate or something like that. This is, a way of really engaging and providing input and those sorts of things.
So I would just say, for the sake of inclusiveness, it does need to be both and. So that physical presence as well as the virtual presence, for all sorts of reasons. But just the sort of inclusiveness piece.
Yeah, it's a good point.
I mean, we're almost done now. I mean, it'd be good just to maybe really quickly get an idea of what could be the first thing that could be done to have the biggest impact, from a positive point of view, I suppose, within the ESG space. In real estate, there must be some quick wins out there. 40% of the world's carbon is produced by the built environment, as you alluded to earlier, Andrew. What could be done to have the biggest impact? I mean, you've got like a minute each to tell me.
Yeah, I suppose from my point of view, it's easy to say, but hard to do, because I do worry sometimes that particularly from a tech point of view, we focus on a lot of shiny new builds that have got great tech in them and from day one are really, really high level. For me, it would be that the industry also really putting a large focus on this retrofit issue for commercial real estate, because we've got a hugely long tail of buildings that are not smart. There are cheap sensors out there now. There are ways you can make some really big impacts just looking at the HVAC in every commercial building in England and the world. If you looked at your HVAC and thought, how well is that running? Have we got some data on our HVAC? Is it on too long? Does it need maintaining? Are we really using that properly? I think HVAC is like 40% of a building's normal, energy. There could be some quick wins on that really long tail of non-smart, non-shiny CBD buildings.
What do you think, Sophie?
Okay, possibly not such a quick win, but what we haven't really touched on here is culture. So for ESG to be done well and in a meaningful way right across real assets, it requires a sort of shift in mindset from that sort of single bottom line of profit to a triple bottom line. So thinking about profit, planet, people. For some, this will very much be business as usual, and I've certainly worked with companies where it is business as usual. They love this stuff. It's brilliant. For others, it's going to require a significant mindset shift. I'm not sure everyone will be able to shift that mindset in quite that way. I think there's a real sort of risk, but also huge opportunities. But yeah, for me, it's about the culture.
Luke, what final thought?
Final word, yes. The final word is not always a benefit, because the one I wanted to say was what Andrew just said, around very quick and easy to win. Throw sensors into your plant machinery, and that's a really straightforward win. And again, I'd plug Demand Logic, who got a lot of airtime at Cretech actually recently, Cretech London. Man, the number of times I heard those two words in combination, Demand Logic, was great for them, great PR for them. But I guess, given that Andrew's made that point, and I want to add some value here, I would say data. Get that data and collect the data. Use platforms that are collecting and analyzing it in appropriate ways, and make sure we're making the correct decisions from that, rather than relying on heuristics. Data would be the key one for me.
Fantastic. Well, look, thanks so much, panelists, for joining me, and thanks everyone in the audience, Tommaso, Yasir, Rupert, Alison, Carol. Loads of people participated, so thank you so much. And look, I hope in the future we'll be seeing loads of green rooftops with locally grown produce on the tops or something like that. It would be amazing. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks so much, panelists, for being here.
Thank you.
Pleasure.